Welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to make a drawstring project bag, and it's just a cute little patchwork drawstring bag. Super easy to make. I'll walk you through the directions step by step. This will fit 4 of the red heart skeins in it. So it's nice. I'm probably going to use mine for collecting all my small projects so that when I go on extended trips, I can keep all my projects close, or just to keep them all next to my bed. So whatever I'm in the mood to work on at that time, I can work on it. Or if I have a big sweater project, which I haven't worked on in a while, maybe I'll stick one in there. I do have a sweater project that I need to finish. I made a second one because I loved this bag so much after I finished it. And on the one that I show you how to make, I only put 1 handle on it. You will have plenty of fabric. You could make a second handle, and I recommend doing this, and I'll talk to you about it a little later. So here's my second one. Kind of looks like a checkerboard. Like, I put the 2 handles on it, and just love how these bags turned out. Today I am using 2 half yards of coordinating fabrics that I've had in my stash for a long time. We're also going to be using a little less than a half a yard of fabric of muslin that's going to be hidden inside the bag. So this can be a fabric that you're not going to use out of your stash, or if you have muslin or an old sheet, it's not going to be seen. You just might not want it to be darker than the fabrics that you're choosing for your bag. I'm also going to be using a craft-sized package of batting. You can use a half yard of batting, or if you'd prefer a bag that's a little stiffer, that stands up a little better, you might want to buy something called Fusible Fleece. This is also a great product if you would prefer not to do the quilting part of the bag, because you would not have to quilt it. You could just iron it on, and I'll tell you when we get to that step where you can iron it on and you won't have to do the quilting part. So I am cutting out of both of my fabrics 4 4.5-inch strips wide of fabric by 18 inches long. I want to make sure I have 4 of the 4.5-inch strips and 2 of the 3-inch strips out of each piece of fabric, or each color of fabric. So now I'm going to lay out and do the patchwork. So we're going to lay out 4 strips of 4.5 inches of the fabrics as shown in the picture. I'm just going to pin them together and take them to the sewing machine. We're going to do a 1/4 inch seam. Whatever seam allowance you're using, make sure to keep it consistent. So I'm using a little piece of washi tape to make sure my stitch width is consistent. That way your squares will all stay the same. I'm going to go ahead and press the seam to one side, and this will help later on when I'm doing my patchwork. I like pressing it to one side so that when I piece the next squares together, I can nuzzle in the seams so that one seam goes one direction and one seam goes the other direction, and it'll help your patchwork squares line up a little better. So we're going to go ahead and make 4 strips across, 2 of each print. And this just makes the patchwork a little faster. Make sure you line up on each end. You don't want to you want to make sure you try to get it as straight as possible because you don't want to lose any of your extra fabric. Because 18 inches is exactly 4 cuts of 4.5 inch strips. So if you have less than 18 inches, you're going to have to cut out an extra strip. This works really great with non-directional prints because as you see, I just turned my fabric upside down. So you'll want to make 2 of these. See how I'm nuzzling those seams together? One side goes one direction and the other side goes the other direction. So when you do your patchwork, this will help them fit perfectly together so that your squares will be lined up correctly. So I'm just trimming off the little tiny ends on the edge there. And then I'm going to sew up both of those strips together. So I'll have 2 sets of 2. And that will be 1 piece for each side of my bag. So you'll have 2 of these panels that match exactly. They're going to be 2 squares wide by 4 squares tall. One is going to be for the back of the bag and one is going to be for the front of the bag. Then for the sides, you'll want 2 panels that are 1 square wide by 3 squares long, because what we're going to do is we're going to have that 4th square is going to be open on both sides of the bag, and we're going to make a gusset so that your bag stands upright. That'll be the base of your bag. So just as it's shown, we want to end up with 2 of the panels that are 2 wide by 4 tall and 4 of the panels that are 3 long. When making this bag, I recommend using non-directional prints. It'll make it a little easier to line up all your squares correctly. So for my fabrics, I have 4 of the 1 square by 3 squares long side pieces. So one of those panels is going to have 2 of the green pieces and 1 of the yellow pieces, and the other one is going to have 2 of the yellow pieces and 1 of the green pieces. I know that sounds super confusing. That's why I made the visuals so that you can see it clearly when you're sewing it together. So we just want to line these up so that you have each panel has each side lined up, and then the squares on the bottom of the bag, on each corner of the bottom of the bag, are going to be left open. And later on, when we go to finish the bag, those are left open so that the bag will stand up tall. And so that's what it's called, is you're going to make a gusset in the bottom of the bag. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to pin one of the sides on each of my bag panels. So I've already pinned the front bag panel together, and now I'm pinning the back bag panel together. Then I'll take those to my sewing machine and we'll sew up the first side. And keep your seams the same that you had done with your patchwork before. That's why I recommend using a strip of tape. I'm using a washi tape. It doesn't stick, doesn't have a lot of sticky. So it won't stick to my machine but it will help me keep track of my seam allowance to make sure I'm the same seam allowance. If you don't have the same seam allowance, your squares can be off and it can mess up your quilting. Or your patchwork, I guess. Consistency is key. You'll want to try not to stretch your fabric so you don't stretch your squares out of alignment either. I like to use a leader. So if you see that little piece of fabric at the end when I'm sewing is called a leader, and that just keeps the fabric from getting pulled down into the machine. So I've gone ahead and I've sewn both of the sides onto each of my panels. And what I'm doing now is I'm pressing those seams, the long seams, open, and the short seams I'm pressing to one side. You'll want to make sure you don't push the iron on the fabric because you don't want to stretch any of your squares. You just want to tap and press to make sure you don't pull your patchwork out of square, because you want this to be, ultimately this piece should be 16 inches wide by 16 inches tall, except for the little squares in the corners. So do you remember the 2 3-inch strips that we cut out of each of our fabrics? Whichever fabric you want to use as your casing, that we're going to fold over in half, and we're going to iron it in half with the wrong sides together. And this is going to be the casing for our bag. So it's going to be on the very top of our bag, and we're going to string our drawstring through it. I'm just prepping it by ironing it in half. We're also going to prep the other fabric of our 3-inch strips. This is going to be for our handles, and we're going to prep it by folding it in half the same way we did for our casing, but we're going to do an extra step. We're going to fold it in half again so that our raw edges get finished. I like to use this wool mat and stick my pins straight in, and I'll link this product below because this is very handy for doing this. Then I don't have to pin it together and it'll hold it together, and I can just stick the pin straight down into this mat and it will hold still. So now I just have to trim my casing a little bit shorter. You can see I bent over to make sure I got my measurement right. I went ahead and cut it to 16 inches wide. This is a little bit, you see my hair and it's driving me crazy, but I can't re-record it now because I didn't see it until later. So pardon my wild bangs that are hanging out. And we'll move forward from there. Let's go back to the casing. So I cut those both down to 16 inches. I'm folding over each of the ends a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to iron down that at a 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to fold in that raw edge into that 1/2 inch iron, and we'll top stitch on that, and that will finish the sides of our casing just like that. We're going to iron over the top of that just to hold it in place, so when we go to top stitch it, it will stay where we want it to stay. With it being such a tiny little seam, it's better to have it ironed so that it stays flat rather than having to pin it. You can also use the little clips. Those would hold it together probably better than a pin would. And I'm just going to do that for both of my casing pieces. And then I'll take them to the sewing machine and we'll sew our handles down and we'll sew the ends of our casing. So in this video, you can see that I only made one handle for my bag because usually I just put one little strap on each side of my bags. But after making this bag, I realized that this bag really needs two handles and there's plenty of fabric. So I recommend making two handles instead of one when you make yours. And I made a second bag so that I could test out that theory, and I liked the two handles better. So I was in the middle of sewing and my thread got to the end of my bobbin thread, so I have to change out my bobbin. So I thought I'd just bring you along for the ride. I like to keep several filled bobbins in my sewing case so that I don't have to stop and unthread my entire sewing machine. I usually keep a very large spool of thread going on the top of my machine. This just keeps me from having to change out my threads so often. So that's why I use white thread the majority of the time. It also saves money as well, having a big spool. But if you have a big spool of thread, you need to have some kind of a spool holder for it because it usually doesn't fit on a regular sewing machine. If you hear my cat purring, he is on my lap because he has to be in the middle of everything I do sometimes. You'll see him cameo in this video in a little bit because sometimes he gets right in the middle of everything. Okay, so right now we are going to use that piece of muslin that I said this is a scrap of fabric that I had in my stash. I'm giving it a quick press just to get out the big wrinkles, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And I had a little seam in there that had to be picked out. So this is going to be inside the bag. You're not going to see this fabric at all. I'm using it so that I can quilt the bag, but also I'm going to put in a lining. So you're not going to see the back of my quilting, just the front of my quilting. So I'm going to layer it up, the muslin, the quilt batting, and the bag panel. And I'm going to layer both of those together, and then we'll pin it down. If you choose to use Fusible Fleece, this is where you would add your Fusible Fleece. So you wouldn't need to have this muslin layer. You would just iron your Fusible Fleece to the back of your patchwork pieces. But you would need to cut it out to the size of the panels because it has fusing on it. So you don't want to get that glue on your ironing board. See, he cameos. I don't know if you have pets and they have to be right in the middle of your project. He likes to sit on projects as I'm working on them. So sometimes you have to put another thing on a table just to get him to move. Having quilting gloves are really handy. If you don't have any quilting gloves, if you have a pair of garden gloves that have the little grippies on it, could be handy as well. So right now what I'm doing is I'm putting on my walking foot. This foot has grips that have like feed dogs on the bottom of it, so it will pull the top of your fabric at the same rate as the bottom of your fabric. This helps to keep your sandwich, your quilt sandwich, moving in at the same speed. So the top of your fabric is moving as the same amount as the bottom of your fabric. If you don't have a walking foot, that's fine. This is not impossible to do. You just want to go slower and make sure it's pinned really well together. This is a small project, so it's not a big deal. It just makes it easier to keep everything lined up correctly. So the way I'm doing this is I'm making sure I'm going from the same direction. And this will also keep my fabric from being, my quilted fabric from being wonky. So I am starting at one side of my quilt panel and working one direction, and then cutting my thread and going back that same direction. If you turn around and go the opposite direction, your quilting panel could end up being, the layers could go, I'm trying to explain this. You'll know if you've done it. So maybe practice a little on a scrap piece of fabric before you do your final bag. It just keeps the fabric from pulling two different directions. Then it would kind of wrinkle in the middle. So it's just best when you're doing this to just continually figure out where your top of your fabric's going to be, and sew from the top to the bottom, the top to the bottom. Keep a consistent format. And this will just help your project turn out better in the end. I'm just continuing to quilt. What I'm doing is I'm quilting I'm using my presser foot to sew a line on each side of my seam for each of the seams. So that's how I'm doing my quilting. If your fabric is too wide on the side, like if it doesn't fit through the neck of your sewing machine, just roll up one of the sides. This is a great project to practice quilting on, because it's just a small project. I actually found it easier to cut the panels apart and do them one at a time than I did by doing them as one large piece. Once your panels are completely quilted, then we'll go in and we will cut all the way around our panels and start sewing them together and making our bag. I'm taking out any pins that I have left. Sometimes when I am sewing it, I'll take out the pins as I'm sewing when I no longer need them anymore. If this is your first quilting project, you may want to use safety pins, not those pins. That way you don't get poked when you're quilting. I just happened to use those, but I was very careful not to poke myself. See my cat loaf again. As soon as I sat that down on my table, he decided that he needed to be part of the project. So I included this little bit so you can See how much fun it is to have a cat in the sewing room. Sometimes it's tons of fun. So once all the quilting is done, or if you choose to do the fusible fleece and just sew it on and don't quilt it, then you'll have already done this part where you trim the piece of fabric to the front of your panels. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out the corners with my scissors to make sure I get those I don't cut too far on those corners. To make sure I don't cut the corners. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm using my rotary cutter and mat just to make quick work of the long seams. And it just makes it so much straighter. If you don't have a rotary cutter and mat, you can obviously do this with scissors, but it is a much easier project to do with the rotary cutter, just for cutting the strips and things like that. I use my rotary cutter cutting mat all the time. And I love that long ruler that I'm using. It's one of my favorite rulers to use, just because it's extra long so that I don't have to fold over my fabric too many times when I'm trying to make long cuts. And some of my mats are pretty beat up, but if you put duct tape on the back of them to hold them together where they've cracked, they can keep on living for a little bit longer. You just avoid cutting in those cracks. You can see the crack in that one right there. So obviously my cat is again in the middle of my project. So what I'm doing now is I'm using the extra fabric that I have left over I'm going to piece it together to make my lining panels. I wanted my lining to look the same on the insides, so I'm going to sew up 2 strips of fabric that are half panels. I'm measuring it to 16 inches wide, and I'm going to cut 16 inches wide by half of the length of the fabric that I have left. Then I'll sew each of these pieces together. So one of the green print, one of the yellow print. It ends up being each piece is 9 inches tall by 16 inches wide. So I'd need 2 of the yellow and 2 of the green. And I'm going to sew those together so that I'll have 2 panels. And what I'll do is I'll use those panels to cut out my lining. So my lining is kind of pieced, but this keeps you from having to buy any more extra fabric. If you want your lining fabric to be one solid piece on the inside, then you'll just have to purchase extra fabric. I wanted to use the rest of my half yards of fabric, and I just kept that patchwork theme going throughout the inside of my bag. So the yellow fabric I'm putting on the top and the green fabric I'm putting on the bottom. I'm going to use the quilt panel on the top as my guide for cutting out the squares at the bottom. This way my gussets will be the same on the inside of my bag as the outside of my bag. Once all of both your lining panels are cut out and both of your quilting outside panels are done, now we're going to sew up the side seams and the bottom seam. We're going to use the same seam allowance, the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And because your panels are exactly the same, the patchwork should line up perfectly on the sides. Once we have all the sides sewn and the bottom sewn, what we're going to do is we're going to open up that bottom gusset that we've left open. So the bottom seam and the top seam. I'm showing you on a different piece of fabric just to make sure I show you to make it easy. So there's the bottom seam and the side seam. We're going to open up the gusset and we're going to match the bottom seam to the side seam. And we're going to pin that together first. Pin those seams together. You'll want that bottom seam to lay the same way on both sides, so make sure you're paying attention to that as well. Now go ahead and line the fabric up and you'll pin all the way across that, and this will create a box at the bottom of your bag so that your bag will lay flat. It's a very simple way to put a nice flat bottom in a bag that doesn't have to be complicated. We want this to be the same on the outside of the bag fabric and the lining fabric. So you'll have to do this 4 times. Twice for the outside of the bag and twice for the lining. You'll want to make sure all your layers are straight. So on this part, go slow. Make sure it's lined up very nicely. There's no creases. If this is your first time putting one in, you may want to open up the bag and look inside and make sure there's no creases where it's folded over, because you'll want to check now before you get it all finished. Okay, now it's time to start putting the bag all together. See, I just have one handle here. Make 2. Okay, let's turn our bag right side out. Oh, it's so pretty. I love this bag. I am probably going to make a ton of these because it comes together so quickly. So lining up our handles, see how pretty the bottom of the bag looks? I'm lining up the handle right there on that first square on each side and pin that in place. That way you don't lose the placement of the handle. And when you put the other handle, just make sure it's exactly the same on both sides. What you'll want to do for the casing is an easy way to center it is to find the center of the casing and line it up with the center of the bag. I should have done that on this, but what I did was I just eyeballed it. But if you want it to make sure it's exactly correct, just fold that casing in half, find that center, and line it up with the very center of the bag. So put all those pieces together. Now we're going to put the lining in. Oh, one thing I forgot to tell you, when you're sewing up the sides of the lining, you want to leave an opening on the side, not on the bottom. It makes this bag a little easier to go back and sew that closed. And I think it just looks nicer to have the opening on the side of the bag instead of the bottom of the bag. So now we're going to put our finished bag inside with right sides together of our lining. And the first thing we want to match up is our side seams. And we're going to use those pins that we already have on the outside of our bag and pin the side seams together. Make sure when you're pinning all together along the top that you're not folding over that casing. Like the casing is between the bag fabric, and put all the right sides together. Make sure you don't move the handles. Make sure they stay right where you want them to stay. Make sure you pin the edge of those casings so they don't fold over when you're sewing. Pinning is the key to this part. But this is one of the easiest drawstring bags that I've ever made. Just because once you get that pinned into place, then we went ahead and sewed where we pinned it. And now we're going to turn it right side out where the magic happens. This is the fun part, when you get to see the whole finished bag. Turn it right side out. You want to make sure that opening is wide enough that you can do this. Like a 2-inch opening is a decent size. I'm going to go ahead and finish my opening, sewing it shut, by adding one of my tags. So I've just went ahead and made a tag that matches my bag, and I'm going to pin it in place on the edge of this opening. I want to make sure that I'm going to top stitch it. I want to make sure I'm catching both layers on the front and on the back. Now all my seams are finished. There's just one more step that I want to do, is I want to go ahead and top stitch around the top of the bag. So I'm going to put all that lining down into the bag. And a handy thing to do at this point is to iron it. That way all your layers flatten out really well. You want to make sure that lining on the inside of your bag lays down so that it doesn't bubble up and wrinkle. You want to hold your casing up at the top. You want to fold the handle down. You'll want to sew over the top of it. And this just gives a nice finished edge at the top of your bag. I did go ahead and speed this up for sake of time for watching it, but make sure you go really slow at this part. You can see that I took my time making sure my lining fabric stayed where I wanted it to stay as I sewed that seam along the top, because that's your nice finished edge and you want to take your time on it. Now it's time to add the drawstring. I bought this drawstring. It's actually a clothesline that I bought at the dollar store. You can use cording. You can make your own drawstring. This cording clothesline cord is perfect for what I wanted to use. You could probably find macrame cording, whatever you want to use for your project. This tool that I'm using, I can't remember the name of it, but I will link where it is or what it is below. It's a really handy tool for pulling cording through your casings. You can use a safety pin as well if you don't have something like this. I'm using the washi tape just to make sure that cording doesn't slip out of my tool. And washi tape's just so handy to have in your sewing room for several different projects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on one end of my bag, and I'm going to pull the cording through both sides so that it ends up on that same side that I pulled it through. And I'm going to do that twice. So I'm going to pull the cording through 2 times, and that'll help create that cinch at the end. I'm giving myself extra cording just to make sure it's long enough, but I'll go back and trim it when I'm all done to get it exactly the size that I want it to be. So one piece goes through, you can see I'm evening it out to make sure it's the same length. And now I'm taking off the washi tape. And then I'll tie those ends into a knot, and later on I'll go ahead and burn the edges so that the edges don't fray. I'm going to do the same exact thing I did on that side on the other side of the bag, because I want to get that cinch. So I want a drawstring on each side. So I'm going to again use that same tool and thread it through both sides of my casing. And I'm using a match to burn the edges so that it doesn't fray, but you can use a lighter, or just make sure it's an adult that's doing it, and be careful. Thanks for taking your time to check it out. I hope if you sew this bag up, you enjoy it just as much as I do. Please subscribe if you like my videos and you want to see more. A thumbs up if you liked it. Have a great day. Happy sewing.